Thank you for joining us on another episode of Latter Gay Stories podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Ashworth, and we have another excellent episode in store for you today. Today's podcast is discussing the interesting intersection of authenticity and honesty and reality, especially where it's meeting at the place where each of us start to grow and experience and thrive in our reality. It's a fantastic episode about the journey through authenticity and honesty and what it takes to not only just survive in life, but to thrive. Today's episode is really, really good. If you are closeted, if you are just beginning your journey of coming out, or if you're a church leader or family member trying to better understand the experience of the LGBTQ community, this is your episode. This is an opportunity to understand really at a heartstrings level what the experience of being gay is like and navigating that world through social experiences, marriage, religious experiences, and personal experiences as well. So without missing much of a beat, I want to welcome to the podcast Kent Carollo.
Welcome. To be here. Glad to be here.
Are you really?
I always. Not that I do these often, but.
I know, professional storyteller, right?
Something like that.
And now before we jump completely into your story, how does it feel to be on the other side of the camera? This is what you usually do to other people.
Yeah, so working in the field that I do, I'm usually getting to ask the questions and, subject people to this positive interrogation, as it were. So it's relatively new to be on this end of things, but exciting no less.
Perfect. Well, it's good to have you judge the setup and critique what we do on this side of the Latter Gay Stories camera.
It's great.
Kent, thank you for sitting down with the audience and giving us a little bit of time to share your story and get to better understand. The interesting part about the podcast is that we really kind of take a beginning, middle, and future approach to a lot of the stories to kind of understand what your experience was like navigating the intersection of LGBTQ Avenue and LDS Street. Because for so many of us, it seems like often our experiences are round holes and square, or round pegs and square holes, or square pegs and round holes. It's really difficult to try to navigate and understand what might be considered normal or normalcy or the experience. So hopefully we can kind of take a deep dive into your experience and someone listening moves forward from it.
Yeah, that's the hope. I think that's always the hope with shared experience, is that somewhere it aligns with where someone else is at or a chapter that they're in, and that connection somehow facilitates either closure or healing, or if nothing else, just hope. So I think while I admittedly don't think my story's particularly unique or inherently inspiring, I still think there is a lot of capacity for shared experience that can help us all navigate and move forward.
Yeah, I like it, and which is exactly what we all need, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about who Kent is, the ingredients, and we'll get into the ingredients a little later in the podcast.
Yeah.
What are the ingredients that make up Kent? What do you do for a living? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so the short of it really is I was raised, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Grew up mostly in Boise, Idaho, served a mission in Phoenix, Arizona, and then did my undergrad studies at BYU, Hawaii, which was just a dream come true, really fantastic experience. After that, landed in Utah. Thought I would go to dental school with my biology degree, but at length returned to my original passion of design and illustration and ultimately marketing, which is what I do primarily now. So come from kind of a scientific, bit of a journalist background by way of education, but these days I'm working more in the creative field of design and marketing and brand strategy here in St. George.
So usually when we start podcasts like this, we say, at what point did you realize I was different? And for Kent, at what point did you realize I'm different?
Yeah. It's so interesting when you get posed a question like that. For me, my brain starts rewinding and I think, how far back do I go to pinpoint that? So I would say that I recognize differences early on. I think a lot of people do. I was raised with 6 amazing sisters, and the only boy in my family. So, there were certainly differences there regardless of my sexual identity. Being raised with women, I think, prepared me to interact with the world in a way that was different from a lot of other, little boys and eventually teenagers, my same age. And it was amazing. I was glad to have that kind of feminine energy and power in my life. And people would always jokingly say, "Oh my gosh, you were raised with 6 sisters. Like, how'd you survive?" And I just always thought, "Oh, I don't know any differently, and here I am." Like, it worked out, right? And I'll joke sometimes like, "Oh, well, I had 6 sisters, so that's why I'm gay." Obviously, just so much feminine energy in my life that it just turned me that way, and obviously not true. But I think early on, despite, family influence or any other influence, there were just things I was passionate about that didn't always align with my peers at that age. I loved Boy Scouts, had great church leaders, and enjoyed camping and all the things that are often associated with, a young man's upbringing. They were great. But I got a taste for music and theater at a young age and really enjoyed that, and started to realize, man, I stereotypically don't align with a lot of my other male peers in some respects. But I really enjoy the arts a lot, and loved theater and really found a home in those spaces when a lot of my peers at the time were pursuing things like baseball and basketball and football. And so I think at an early age, I just realized what I was passionate about, what I was pulled toward. And certainly that doesn't make one gay or anything else necessarily. But it certainly started to highlight some of the differences between myself and other young men my age. So I think around that time I started to realize, not, oh, I think I'm gay, but, I think I'm different to a degree. I didn't know what that meant. There were certainly some kind of highlights there. And it wasn't until junior high that started to have a negative connotation. And how I dressed or acted and hanging out with girls in junior high did subject me to a degree of bullying or being singled out. And at that point, I didn't realize really what I was being accused of with the slurs that were being thrown my way. I just thought, oh, I'm being singled out and this does not feel good.
Did you feel like that was like your peers and the public was singling you out, or personally, was there an internal struggle, something you learned, heard, maybe associated yourself with certain descriptors that caused that as an internal struggle, or was it just your outward appearance caused other people to comment?
Yeah, I think it was maybe a bit of both. I certainly don't hold a lot of trauma around, I guess, bullying. I was subject to some of that, for a short time in junior high when I transitioned from, 6th grade elementary school to 7th grade junior high. I expect that's the case for a lot of people, unfortunately. It's a tough jump to make. But outwardly, I was probably just as kind of awkward and gangly and, not at ease with myself as anyone going into 7th grade. But yeah, I hung out with girls. I felt comfortable with female friends, and that subjected me to like some criticisms and some bullying here and there. But I think to your point, a lot of it is just the story I told myself, right? Like, oh, I'm being singled out, or I'm being excluded by other peers my age, and this isn't a good thing. This is like not favorable. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe something's wrong with me. And so you certainly start this internal narrative that can direct how you view yourself. And so during that chapter, there were definitely those narratives starting to form of maybe I didn't know why or what people were saying or perceiving about me, but started to pick up on I'm different and I'm being singled out as a 7th grade awkward kid entering junior high in ways that other people aren't necessarily, who seem to fit in more. And so something might be off and I might be doing something wrong if this is happening.
And that's where the contortion starts, where you start bending and contorting yourself into something you may or may not really be.
Yeah. And at that time, at that age, I know being, a seventh grader, I didn't have a lot of context for what being gay was. I didn't, when, people would call you like a homo or a fag in the hallway, that didn't hurt per se, because I didn't really have context like for what that meant. And I remember so innocently just thinking like, what do they mean? Like, I don't get that. Like, I didn't mentally have that definition or context for what they were even, harassing me about or thinking I was or who I was. And that didn't come till a lot later. So it was an odd time to sort of just feel like something seems off with certain people who seem to disagree with who they think I am,
Yeah,
whether I am that
you.
thing or not.
At what point, now as you're navigating that, do you? I think your message about not having language for those particular feelings or characteristics is super common in the church.
Expect.
Yeah. And just growing up, like a lot of us, there really isn't a manual that describes and explains the growing up stage. It was funny, like I had an interview a few episodes back with Jessica and Savannah said she had an 18-year awkward stage as part of her like growing up, and I relate to that. It's like, I know what that feels like, that 14, 15-year awkward stage where you have all these things going on in your brain, but you can't label them because you don't understand them, and maybe Mormonism has a little part to do in the taboo nature of a lot of topics in the church, but also just like our traditional Mormon families, there's so much left unsaid that that's part of the exploration.
Yeah, I think a lot is left unsaid, and certainly not out of trying to be malicious or damaging, right? I think for most families and most people, until you are confronted with something, you may literally just not have an excuse to like face it or question it or even form your own narrative around it. So if you believe that you don't know someone who's gay, you probably do, even if you don't know you do. But if you're a parent and you think, I don't know anyone who's gay, or I don't have gay friends, like it's not really on my radar, and then you have a kid come out and say I'm gay, it's kind of like, oh, well, I have not invested any thought into this because I've never really needed to until this point. And so I think that can shape a lot of the dialogue. Like, I think sometimes there's a narrative of almost ignorance of just like, well, I don't think we have gay people in our school or in our church or where we live, so what's the point in talking about it?
Yeah, when we leave them out of sight, they become out of mind, and that's not the healthiest situation to be in.
Yeah, and so again, I don't think it's intended to be some sort of like exclusionary or damaging practice, but ignorance often is, whether you intend it to be or not. And it's sometimes not so much what's said, but what is not said that leaves kind of that impact and sometimes trauma around that space.
So if junior high was the ignorance is bliss, and I'm now starting to semi-understand exactly what my experience might look like, what does high school look like?
So this is actually a really good question, and I'm glad you followed up with that, because I'll say the 7th grade, that transition year for me was really hard. I don't think I knew it at the time, but I actually was depressed. And, looking back, thinking how difficult that was, I didn't know what to call it, but I was like, man, I'm not sleeping well. I'm not eating well. I don't have an appetite. I feel like kind of sad and tired like most of the time. I had friends I would engage, like I was okay, but not okay. And so the real change came when I found community. So, like I said, I took a liking to music, when sports didn't quite work out for me. And joining choir when I was in like 7th grade, 8th grade, just gave me the sense of community that I didn't even realize I needed. I thought I had community with the Boy Scouts and my friends at church and in my neighborhood, and I did. But that felt a bit more like showing up for them, like contributing to something that was kind of engineered for a certain group of guys who had certain interests, and I would show up for that, and it was fine. But I felt like a bit of a bystander sometimes. But joining choir and eventually jumping into community theater in Boise, where I grew up, felt like I was showing up for me, and I could actually contribute something and bring something to that. And it was appreciated, it was valued. There was space for me to be a flamboyant seventh grader if I wanted to be. There was space to do things that I thought were less masculine, like sing and put on a costume and perform on a stage. And that space completely reshaped the view of myself, of who I was, who I wanted to be, and really just gave me the confidence to move forward through junior high and then into high school. And so I can honestly say that finding community there is what gave me the best quality of life I could have had through that remaining chapter, through junior high, through high school. I just found a place to thrive and to feel safe. And I have teachers and friends to thank for that. But that really, as sort of dramatic as it sounds, was, I would say, the key component that gave me the best quality of life. I felt like I could really give my best and receive the best in that community and in those circumstances. And that really, really gave me good footing moving through that chapter through high school.
And as you progressed through, you mentioned that you served your mission in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. So that progression and having a space and having responsibility and nourishment by teachers and friends in high school is great. But what happens when you get sent in the lone and dreary world of the mission field, where how much of that influenced your experience there? Were you able just to block all that by refocusing your efforts? What was your mission experience like?
Yeah, so I'll say this, right around the time I graduated high school, I was cast in a musical in Boise, Idaho. And, Boise's, it's a growing town, but, not huge. But being cast in that musical as a leading role in my hometown really kind of launched a confidence in me that I hadn't had for a long time. And there were people who showed up. It was all volunteer based. And I had someone who was like, hey, you're the lead in this musical that's going to play for the whole city, and it's, big deal for Boise. And I had people show up who were like, we're teaching you how to tap dance. You're going to come to my studio, we're going to teach you how to do this. And we know you're only 17, about to turn 18, but we're casting you in this lead role because we think you can do it. And we're going to train you to do it and teach it. And these people in my community rallied around me in a way that I was like, oh my gosh, as someone in high school who's loved, doing theater and always vying for that leading role, this was kind of the apex of opportunity for me at that point in my life. And after that musical wrapped up, I turned 18, had about a year before I was going to serve a mission. But that opportunity and realizing oh my gosh, with help and encouragement, I can do anything. I can learn how to tap dance. I'd never seen a tap shoe in my life. And then I'm performing these, dance numbers and all these crazy things on stage in front of my community. So going into the mission, I think I was set up the best way that I could have been to think, I can do anything if I have enough practice and the right help and the confidence to do it. So at this point, going into a mission, the thought that I was gay still wasn't really on my radar. And so for me, it was the thought that I can take the best that I have and go and share it with wherever I end up serving. And for me, that was Phoenix. And I just entered with, I think, a confidence and an optimism of just, okay, this is a chance for me to go do my best, give my best, be my best.
To replace your tap shoes with
Yep.
Mr. Mac Echoes.
Yep, you got it. And for me, the mission was a really remarkable experience, and in a lot of ways, but I'll say specifically, it gave me a chance to engage with peers in a way that I often felt I lacked, especially with other, guy friends. Doing musical theater and choir is great. I still have lifelong friends from all of that. But for the most part, we were similar, right? Had similar interests, similar passions, and to be on a mission where you're paired with someone as a companion who could be a world away from you, or even in the same country or the same state, someone who just is very different from you. It was significant for me in that chapter to form a healthy relationship with another guy who I was really different from, or who in other circumstances I might have felt intimidated by, or who was really good at sports when I was terrible at sports. Like the mission to me, while it served, as a vehicle to build my faith and this foundation and the gospel and all of that, which, at the time it served its purpose. But more than that, it taught me about just, I have the capacity, whether I'm gay or not, to form meaningful relationships with other men that have nothing to do with a sexual attraction or that chemistry. And I think that was a really valuable formative experience for me in that chapter, because it wasn't something that I often had, up to that point.
That's what I was thinking just as you were speaking, just thinking of you growing up with a household full of women, sisters, and then musical theater, which is primarily women. Or surrounded by that, like growing up in high school and junior high, just that your harem is a circle of women that run
Most
around
often.
with. So it completely makes sense. And I think that story would probably resonate with a lot of people who are listening to this who serve missions. Mm-hmm. And in my mission, it was unique too, because here was the first opportunity to live. I mean, I had roommates in college also, but to live with another guy who you would give a hug to every night, and the closeness that missionaries experience. At least in our mission, we were pretty close.
Yeah.
And I think that's consistent through most missions throughout the church, that here was the ability to really bond at a masculine level, exactly as you explained it, non-sexual, there wasn't anything hyper about it. It was clearly just a different bond that's unique and sometimes special.
Yeah, and I expect that shows up for people in different ways, all over. I expect, like in the military, for example, you would form very similar, like that kinship, that brotherhood, because you're working so hard to achieve something together. And I think the mission field is similar for a lot of us who maybe don't, have a military experience, but feel that bond and kinship in a really healthy and significant way.
A heightened level of protection.
And it may have nothing to do with, any romantic chemistry or sexual chemistry. For some, maybe it does, but for me, it was just a great chance to have that experience, to form meaningful relationships in a healthy, meaningful context.
What years did you serve?
I served in Phoenix from 2005 to 2007.
So you were, I was just curious where that lined up with a lot of the topics of the day, especially like Prop 8 and those things, but you were pre that.
Yeah.
Do you remember teaching anybody who was on the LGBTQ spectrum while as a missionary?
Yeah. It's interesting to look back, because I honestly don't remember like a lot of experiences. And most of them I think seemed so foreign to me in just odd ways. When I think about it, I think, how did I think about homosexuality at that point in my life? And it just really wasn't anything I ever had to really like tackle head on. Like we'd teach someone or meet someone and it was like, oh, I think they're probably gay. But that was kind of it. It wasn't so much like, oh, they're outwardly gay and they led with that and we now have that out there and we're going to engage them anyway. Like it was, I remember one time we were tracting though and knocked on a door and a man opened the door and was like, oh, come on in, elders. And he's like, well, my husband and I, have lived here for a few years and he was a member and he was just very kind, offered us water. But I remember leaving there thinking like, someone has a husband. Someone's doing it. Like they made it this far. Like they're not some jaded, angry ex-Mormon living alone and just spiteful at they have a beautiful home with like nice art on the walls and like a husband, and they're comfortable and they don't hate me as a missionary and like, whoa. And so that does stand out in my mind as like one small blip of experience on the mission where I was like, they're okay. Like they're living a life and they're not afraid of that. They're not afraid of me as a missionary. They're not angry at me. They just are gay and they are.
I think there's like a whole podcast episode in just that experience because so many of us who were raised in the church or who even are active in the church today will look at that and say, why did you associate all those things with contradictory happiness? Like, he lives in a nice home, he's happy, he's having obviously good experiences, he's not bitter. Well, I wouldn't recognize those things if I hadn't at some point been taught that all those things wouldn't exist on this side of the aisle.
Absolutely. And that's a really fair point, and it probably is another podcast, but I would say to that point, I don't think, like I said, the culture I was raised in is inherently malicious or, out to necessarily, demonize anyone. But again, it can happen as a side effect, right? The way you speak around certain topics or speak around certain things can, indirectly start to form views of other things. And so with a dialogue that does emphasize so frequently and so directly, there's a way, and this is what happens if you follow that way, and this is what happens if you don't, you do form that internal narrative. And I certainly did. I grew up with amazing, well-meaning people. My family, my friends, my church leaders who I know wanted the best for me. And it wasn't so much they were homophobic or anti-anything or anyone, but some of the language used on a consistent basis just started to convince me internally that, well, if I'm gay, then I'm not Mormon. And if I'm gay, then I'm not worthy. And if I'm gay, then X, Y, Z. So naturally, you combat the possibility that you might be gay because you don't see yourself as apostate, sinful, lazy, misled, however you want to categorize yourself. Like, if you don't believe that about yourself, then it's hard to imagine that you're gay because you just can't seem to resolve a conflict between those identities.
Which I think is an excellent way of helping the audience to understand why so many remain closeted and so many remain repressed and push that away, or in Book of Mormon musical terms, turn it off.
Yeah.
Or put it in a box and squash it.
Yeah.
Because I am not all those things that religion, Christianity, society says about me. Therefore, I must not be gay, or I must not be fully whatever they think I am, because I'm not. I still have spiritual experiences. I still feel happy. I still feel joy, and all these things. So
yeah,
I think that's a great way of articulating that experience.
Yeah, and it can get further complicated when you start to realize, well, I'm doing all the things I understand to be right and true and correct. And yet I still feel like maybe I'm gay, or maybe this is something I have to fix or deal with. But I held the priesthood my whole life, and I never missed conference, and I have held leadership positions. I served a mission. I held leadership positions as a missionary. I studied at a church school. I got married, and that's something, that came later for me. But you reach a point where you do all the things you believe are best and true, and when there's no boxes left to check and you still feel a certain way, you have to start asking really significant and often difficult questions.
Let's venture down that often significant and difficult question course. You end up leaving your mission and life begins. Where does that road take you? Obviously, BYU Hawaii at some point, and marriage. So let's kind of walk that path and understand your experience.
Yeah, so finished the mission, 2 years, loved it. It was wonderful. Thought I was going into art school before I started the mission, but kind of had a course change and thought, I like art, but I think I want to be a dentist, which is funny to say out loud because largely unrelated fields. But I had met people and grew up with some people who I thought, that's a skill I would love to have, that I think would be valuable, not in my own community even, but even abroad. So I loved this idea of becoming a dentist and, taking that dental resource where it might be needed and being able to offer help in developing communities or underserved communities. So I went that route, studied biology at BYU Hawaii right off the mission. Had amazing opportunities there. The remarkable thing about the Le'i'e campus at BYU Hawaii is that it's a smaller school, and as a result, allow so much more opportunity. So if you're at a larger university, you really kind of have to dial in and specialize because there's competition to get into your department, and you really just got to major on your major so that you can follow that trajectory. At BYU Hawaii, while that is still true to a degree, the smaller nature of the campus really gave me freedom to study biology, but I was working as a layout artist for the school paper and eventually became a writer and an editor there. I was singing in the salsa band because they needed some vocalists. I was working at the Polynesian Cultural Center part-time because I wanted to absorb and learn about those cultures. I got to be members of clubs. Like it was a remarkable space to study and to major, in biology, but to learn and to interact and to grow in ways I don't think I could have elsewhere. And so that was a really amazing opportunity. I dated, who later became my wife there for a short time, went our separate ways, and then circled back by the time I graduated in 2012 from BYU Hawaii, and got married, stayed married for 3.5 years, and at length in that marriage realized there were parts of my identity I just had never confronted and never talked about. And not because my wife didn't give me a safe space or that she did anything wrong, but there are truthfully just some things you don't know until you cross that point in your life, until you marry someone, until you actually test that water, as it were. And so I learned a lot by the time I actually got married that I just didn't know before.
I want to spend just a couple minutes in this space because this is often such a taboo topic that nobody wants to discuss, and also something that nobody or very few people recognize as being an issue. And I don't really want to single out Mormonism here because I think this is a broader topic in Christianity and religion in terms of fidelity, celibacy prior to marriage. But this is a really important discussion about not knowing what you don't know. And when we live in a society, a religious society that teaches abstinence and celibacy prior to marriage, there are so many, and I want to just frame this specifically in Mormonism given the audience, but there are so many who get into a relationship, date, have good experiences because it's often cordial and friendship and social, which is the dating aspect, and often we have no issue with the dating side and getting to know people. But the nature of marriage in Mormonism is that it is eternal and forever. It's not often a courthouse marriage that can easily be dissolved down the road if circumstances permit. But when you add the eternal celestial temple narrative into a marriage, and the church and members will agree, like those marriages are traditionally remain more solid and connected, but it's not always the healthiest situation because for the first time we experience our sexuality after that chain has been welded together. After the temple, before, there is no time to turn around and say, because the nature of Mormonism is that now that you're sealed together for time and all eternity, you're sealed together for time and all eternity. And so let's talk a little bit about that. I know that was a long way into getting to kind of what I want to explain, but I think this can be very beneficial to people who are on the outside, who are maybe closeted, pursuing this idea that maybe a mixed orientation marriage could work, or even a broader audience who looks at this and says, is there a negative annotation, a negative experience with abstinence, and how do we mitigate this safely and correctly?
So the first thing that comes to mind as I hear you speak to that is just you are allowed to use your God-given agency to do what you believe is best at the time. And there's no shame in that. I married an incredible woman because that was the best thing for me to do at the time. And I knew that at the time, and I believed that at the time. And I believe it now, in hindsight. I don't look back and think, what was I thinking? That was the biggest mistake of my life. I knew in the moment that was the best thing for me at that time. And the caveat to do your best in that moment is also you're allowed to change as a person. You're allowed to learn and evolve and to then reevaluate what's best for you at the time. And so for me, I have no regrets around the marriage. I have no regrets around, having that amazing and honestly kind of sacred experience in being married to someone who was amazing and who was patient with me and who lovingly gave me the space to have the hardest conversations I've ever had in my life. With her, mostly with myself, with a therapist, and with God. And she saw me through that. And the outcome was frankly not in her favor. But she gave me the space to do that, as painful as it was for both of us. And so to speak to that, it is tough because the idea that, if I had just given myself the freedom to explore sexually, prior to marriage, I would have had a much better idea or a frame of reference to how I felt when I kissed a guy versus kissed a girl, or even just engaged emotionally with either. I never gave myself that space. I didn't even entertain the possibility that I could be gay, and I never planned a future as a gay man. I never considered that as being on the table. It just wasn't in the realm of options. And so for me, with my upbringing in the church, and then kind of this next step after college, marriage just wasn't optional. It was mandatory. And I don't blame anyone for that. But the culture I was raised in certainly shaped that view. And so, the woman I married was the one I wanted to marry. We circled back. We had dated before, right, in college, and then she was on my mind, for those years we were apart. And I thought if I ever had another chance, I'm going to take it. And I did. And, going into the marriage, I knew that I was doing the best that I could at the time. And I did discuss briefly the fact that I thought I could be attracted to men, shared that with her, and we took some time to think about what that was going to mean and what that might look like. But the truth is, I didn't know enough about myself in that moment to speak any more to it. I told her everything I knew about myself at the time. And that was, I think I've been attracted to men before, and I've never done anything about it. And that was the truth. I mean, that was my body of evidence at the time. And so I wasn't particularly concerned because, I didn't have anything to go on. I didn't have contrast. I didn't have some experience of having dated a guy for a while and seeing what that felt like and drawing a contrast. There just wasn't dialogue to be had around it. And I had never even engaged in a dialogue with a therapist or another human around the possibility that I could be gay. She was really the first one I even said that to.
And what was that coming out experience like?
It's so interesting because it wasn't even coming out at that point. It was if you're going to marry me, know that I think I've been attracted to men, but I'm not worried about it. And I've never done anything about it. So I wasn't even I think I'm gay, because it still just didn't register. I'm just I'm definitely not gay, but I notice men sometimes, or I think I felt chemistry sometimes, but just had nothing to go on. And so it didn't even feel like coming out at that point. It was still so shameful and heavy for me to even speak to in that moment. But it was hardly coming out because I just didn't, you know what I mean? It's if I don't have a boyfriend, and if I have never engaged, if I've never been part of gay culture, then what is gay then? Other than some label I'm giving myself as someone who's thought about possibly being gay. So it's a weird space to be in when you literally just have no frame of reference for what that even means.
But at some point there had to have been a transition from, I don't know how to label this, nor am I interested in labeling this because I'm not there.
Yeah.
What changed to get you there?
Yeah, so we were, I would say, very happily married for 3.5 years. And naturally, after years of marriage, you start talking about a family. And I think for me, it just felt if we're going to take the next step and possibly have kids, I want to make sure I'm as ready as I can be for that step. And I started to get mounting anxiety and just a lot of just stress and kind of discord around the idea of being a father. And I didn't know why. I didn't know if it was just, holy smokes, this is the next big step and a life changer. I didn't know if it was something else. But I finally pinpointed it in and of myself, and I just realized, you know what? I think deep down I know that I'm gay, and if I am, I'm not ready to be a father. And I entered a pretty dark space because my internal narrative started saying, Kent, if you're gay, you're not worthy to raise kids. And if you're gay, you're not a worthy priesthood holder. And if you're gay, even if you stay married, you're going to spend the rest of your life destroying the lives of your children because you're so warped and so completely broken because you're gay that you are not fit to ever raise children. You do not have the tools, the capacity, the spiritual, the mental kit to raise offspring. And unfortunately, I committed to that narrative. I just thought, if this, then this. If I'm gay, I cannot be a father, whether I stay married or not. I disqualified myself completely. So at length I did share that with my wife and said, I think I'm gay, and if I am, I have a lot of reservations about having kids right now. So I think I need to do something about it. And that was the first time we'd really circled back to that conversation in 3.5 years. And the first time I ever sought help and ever allowed myself to talk about it. And so I did. I finally started seeing a therapist, met with them for 6 months, had some really hard conversations. Things got far worse before they got better, but at length determined that we were going to divorce and I was going to move forward, whatever that looked like for both of us.
Give us some examples of what got worse.
Yeah.
Because I think that probably pricked a few ears.
Yep.
What were some of the red flags, white flags, rainbow flags that said?
So I'll admittedly get really emotional in this because it was an emotional time, but it's a really kind of sacred space to navigate because I honor the role that my wife played through all this. And I hope, however it happens, that she realizes the role she played. Because the truth is, we divorced. Divorces are hard, but there wasn't anger or hate involved in the directions we went. But it still hurts, and it's still hard. But it got worse because I entered a therapist's office knowing I wasn't gay. Just wasn't a possibility. And after months of walking through this, and the therapist kind of saying, you are, but it's okay. Like, you can be gay. You can be gay and you can be anything you want, but you're allowed to accept that part of yourself and then choose how it shapes any decisions moving forward. But that broke me further because I just thought, no, like I'm not gay. Don't tell me I am. Don't, I don't want to hear that. I just need you to tell me how to stay married. And I will do whatever I need to do that, no matter what it costs. And the part where it got worse is that as soon as I had that knowledge that, wow, I think I'm gay, and the longer back in my life I look, the more I realize that's always been true. Because my therapist would ask me, well, when do you think you turned gay then? When did that shift? What happened? What turned that switch on? And I went back year after year. And I remember he posed me the question, he's like, Kent, when did you become unacceptable? And I just turned page after page of my, mental personal history. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have believed I've been unacceptable most of my life. And not because someone sat me down and told me that, but like just who I innately was, I just thought was worthy of shame and embarrassment and, was just so unacceptable. And that was hard to realize, that I really believed that, and I committed to that narrative for most of my life. I mean, I would watch home videos of myself as a kid and just cringe and think, why didn't someone hit me upside the head and say, Kent, little boys don't dress up in girl clothes and dance around the living room, or Kent, like, you really need to dial in your masculine energy and like make this work with sports and all these things. And like, I just thought I've been unacceptable for most of my life. And I really, for some reason, just believed that. And all that to say, as soon as I realized, like, if I was gay, it almost felt like it confirmed the narrative. Like, well, that's why. I wasn't acceptable this whole time. But the further back I went, it also proved that nothing happened that made me that way. And there was only one possible explanation as to why I was that way. And it wasn't because I chose to be that way, and it wasn't because something shaped me into that way. When you are 4 years old at a hotel, and the first thing you think of doing when you see a grand piano is getting on top of it and lounging on it like one of Bob Barker's showgirls on The Price is Right, it's not because someone told you you were supposed to do that. Like, it's not because somebody said, like, you're a gay little boy and this is what gay little boys do. That was in me. That came built in. That was on the hard drive. And that is one of a myriad of examples if you comb through our home videos, you know?
My mom sent me a picture of me in a crop top mesh black shirt in front of the lion drinking fountain at the Hogle Zoo.
Yeah.
And I was like, the Bob Barker girl as well.
Yeah.
And she's like, I should have known.
You know?
And I look at that, I'm like, clearly.
You know, and
Yeah.
for some people, maybe that's an indicator, right? For other people, they're as gay as I am and they'd never do anything like that.
Yeah.
But for me, like, that was shameful and unacceptable, and it would just cringe seeing that. And so having a therapist confirm, you know, you're gay, but it's okay, was a hard pill to swallow. Because accepting that I was made me feel like if I accepted that, then I was unacceptable in all the ways I thought I was. And that was hard. And I reached a place at that point where I just had to strip the scaffolding of the church, of society, and of any voices that had shaped my narrative and talk to God very directly. Because I reached a point of such desperation that I thought, if peace doesn't come, and if I can't find a resolution to the conflict that I'm in, I will take that as a sign that I no longer have anything else to learn in mortality. Like, if this doesn't subside, then there is nothing left for me to do here. And it's hard to speak to because you don't want anyone to enter that space. You don't want to even entertain the possibility that ending your life is the best possible outcome for your circumstances. It's hard to talk about because I don't even want to plant that seed in someone's mind. But I have to speak to it because other people have that thought in mind. And have and will. And I just reached that place where I thought, if the resolution and the peace won't come when I am trying so hard to make a marriage work, and I am trying so hard to show up to the temple and to church and to magnify callings and do everything I believe to be the best and truest thing I could be doing. If I do all of that and feel like I can't function, then something is wrong. And the parallel I draw again and again is the idea of being dragged behind a lifeboat and holding on to a rope and surviving. It felt like in that moment that if I just held on, I could not die. I could catch my breath every now and again. I could just continually be pulled behind a lifeboat and I could not die. Every day I could just keep holding on and do my best and stay in a marriage and stay in the church and hold a job and engage occasionally in conversation with people without sobbing, and just hold on for dear life. And the mental picture I had that changed my mind was the idea that as long as I held onto a lifeline with both of my hands as tight as I could, I would never be able to open my hands to anyone else. And I could not live a life like that. It was not the life that I was taught to live, and it was not the life that I wanted to live. The church, my family, my community showed me very early on that the most fulfilling life I could live was one that allowed me to lift and to love and to help and to serve other people. And if I was solely focused on surviving, I was not in a position to open a hand to anyone else. And more importantly, I wasn't in a position to open my hand and receive help from anyone else.
Because you would, both of those hands were on the rope.
White knuckling most days for a long time. And as soon as that mental picture formed, I just thought, Kent, you need to be in a place where God can give you the best, but be in a place where you can be giving your best. And I believe both of those things. I believe that God wants to give us the best that he can, and I also believe he expects us to give the best that we can. And I wasn't doing those things. And I couldn't help but think that while a marriage is good, and while maybe I was happy and being in the church was good, I started to realize slowly that it wasn't the best for me. It was okay, and it had served me for a season and most of my life up to that point. But it wasn't the best, and I certainly could not give my best because I wasn't authentic and I wasn't healthy. If you find yourself in a position, whether it's in a family or a church or any environment where you are unwell and unhealthy, you are allowed to leave. And that's not said out loud enough. It's not said over pulpits enough. I think often that if I ever found myself at that pulpit at General Conference, I would want to look into the faces of everyone there and just simply state, the Lord and the church loves you enough and trusts you enough to allow you to leave. And the Lord and the church love you enough to accept you if you ever come back. But if you don't, we send you on your way with our full blessing and know that you are going to be the best that you can wherever you are. And the truth is, I think most people inside and outside of our faith believe that. I would love to hear it more clearly articulated and more frequently from that pulpit. But it's something that I have to remind myself of. And I frankly just say it to myself because I don't hear it from a pulpit.
I think we can, I just want to kind of give an overview of what we just discussed because I think there's incredible power in that. So many of these decisions that you made to end the marriage, to begin dating, to understand what is authentic and honest in your life came on the premise of hypothecation, not knowing what the other side of the aisle looked like. All of that happened because I know this isn't working. I don't know what this is because I haven't yet experienced it. But in the middle, in that moment, I need to do what's most healthy and what feels most natural. And that's some really difficult space to be in because sometimes we think all of this is just imagined, is fairy tale. Am I making these big decisions based on just selfish feelings, selfish ambitions, which are all of the things we talk about in the church to avoid, that your selfishness will never bring happiness. No man can serve two masters. Did at any point you feel I am selfishly walking into this, making wrong decisions based on the man, the natural man, which is an enemy to God? And how do you reconcile that with the desire for happiness to move forward?
Yeah. I questioned my decisions most days, especially in that chapter of my life where I was deciding whether or not I could or should stay married. I studied biology at BYU Hawaii, like I said, and then worked, as a journalist, as a layout artist for a school newspaper. I learned a lot about journalism in 4 years that I worked there. I learned a lot about science and research and the necessity to cite your sources and to have peer-reviewed research before you make any claims or draw any conclusions. And the same goes in journalism. You can't quote someone falsely, and you can't make a claim that isn't substantiated by someone's direct quote or input. You can't invent feedback that doesn't exist if you don't want to be confronted or, at worst, sued for that. And that carried over into this process of navigating all of this. I started to realize that all of these narratives and all these stories I was telling myself were being fact-checked by no one, and likely wouldn't be. Were not being substantiated. And I had to fix that. And it's an odd pairing of my past experiences that led me to that conclusion of having studied biology and worked in journalism that led me to that, conclusion. But I realized I was telling myself a lot of stories, and I was not checking the sources, and I was not getting peer-reviewed research on these narratives. And I realized that I was not fact-checking the very stories that I was telling myself. And I started to realize there was no reason for that. In the same way you write a research paper or an article, you run that by panels of editors. You get it fact-checked and reviewed before it ever sees the light of day. And here I was living a life where I decided if I was gay, what that meant. I decided if I divorced, what that meant, with absolutely no substantiated research to make those claims in my head valid. And so it took a therapist to help me clarify some of those narratives I was telling myself. It took the input of other people, and it took stepping outside of my faith for a while, at least the construct of it, and looking beyond that at what was true for me, not what was kind of the largely accepted universal truth of the LDS Church, but like what was true for me. I got married in the temple. I did my best. And things I felt I was promised and results I was guaranteed didn't materialize. So while it might be true for some, I started to realize that wasn't true for me, and I was allowed to question that. And I was allowed to look for cues and proof and evidence to say, this can be true for some, but is it true for you? And I had to really start incrementally fact-checking my own stories. And as I did that, I found a lot more clarity. And you raised a really good point in what you said about how did you eventually substantiate these claims, and coming out and divorcing. And I remember the first time, after the divorce and trying to date, that I had my first kiss with a guy. And I got in my car shortly after and was driving away, and I sobbed. I sobbed. I called up my best friend and I just said, Spence, I am not crazy. I have spent my entire life convincing myself that every desire I've had, every inclination is because I was lazy, misled, drawn away by the wiles of the devil, blinded by the craftiness of men, anything you want to label it. I was on a dark path. I had let go of the rod. I had gone astray, prodigal son, whatever. That's why I was gay. I did this to myself. I convinced myself this is what I needed and this is what I wanted. And I had a simple kiss with a guy for the first time, and I completely broke down because I knew in an instant that I was not crazy. I knew in an instant that I had felt something physically, emotionally, mentally, that I had never felt in my life. And there's anger there because you think, I was told something. I was guaranteed something. And the sad truth is I could take what I just told you to someone else and say, I felt something real. I felt something I hoped to feel my whole life with a woman and never did. And someone could look me in the face and say, you're wrong. You're incorrect. That's the Satan trying to fool you. But luckily at that point in my life, I was well past that. I was well past accepting what people perceived to be true for me and starting to finally take ownership of what I knew was true for me. And so it took small experiences like that. It took literally divorcing an amazing woman who I had married in the temple and then realizing that I survived it. I literally just survived it, and that my life didn't fall apart. God didn't punish me for committing this heinous sin of divorce as I knew he would. Leading up to the divorce, it was no question. If I divorce, I will be unhappy. My life will be ruined. I'll be unworthy of love. I will never find peace again. And it wasn't even a question in my mind. I'm like, but I have to do this. I have to divorce, and I'm willing to subject myself to those miseries in exchange for hurting a woman I'm married to and enduring the pain I'm in there. So I'll just trade. At least I can free her, and I'll just exchange that for this new set of consequences. But after I divorced and I realized, oh my gosh, there are people waiting to accept me, waiting to support me, waiting to show love and allyship and kindness. And it didn't add up. Because in my mind, I just thought, I'm not supposed to be happy after this. I'm not allowed to go find joy after this. I'm not at liberty to pursue, personal joy and love after I've ended a marriage in the temple. Like, I don't have that right anymore. But in time, it wasn't adding up, and I realized I was made, promised that my life would be miserable if I broke this commandment and ended this marriage, but it's just not true for me. And it's likely not true for a lot of other people. And I started to fact check these things, and I just thought, this isn't adding up. And I think I am allowed to be happy, and I think I am allowed to pursue joy again. And more than that, I think I might even be worthy of it in ways that I didn't think I was. And so it took time, but when you start to realize that the very worst you planned on isn't happening the way you thought it would, you begin to realize that you can still be an amazing, capable, incredible person despite having gone through some really hard things. And honestly, despite having broken covenants you thought were so critical to your happiness and well-being. There is joy to be had whether you remain in the church, and that same joy to be had if you find yourself outside of it. And it needs to just be said more. I believe that God, or however you view a higher power, has given all of us that agency, that we do have God-given talents, that we have an amazing capacity to live and to lift and love. And I am convinced that you can do all of those things as an upstanding, devout member of the LDS Church. And there is no exception to you doing all those same things outside the church. And that has become very real to me, because some of the people who shaped me and helped me and lifted me at my lowest had nothing to do with the church. And there were many who did. And I started to realize quickly that the church was no longer a qualifier to who was capable of Christ-like love. And that started to show me that there was joy to be had wherever I found myself. Whether that was as someone who had divorced someone else, whether that was someone who wasn't going to church anymore, or someone who was gay, or those capacities are just not exclusive to the faith you find yourself inside or outside of.
I like I love everything you've said. Like I just nodded the whole, and I know those who are listening resonate and can relate to exactly what you're talking about, because it's the honest truth. It is the experience. And I also like how you bring up capacity and labels and ingredients and all the things that we are, because it's so easy to, as we've listened to your story, and in the last part of this part of this episode that I'd like to kind of focus on is how we naturally find ourselves labeling and classifying who and what we are broadly, when our realities and the truth of our experience is that we are many things. Mm-hmm. And this is one lesson. This is actually where I really met Kent, was in your discussion about ingredients. And it was so profound to me how, and just a little background, you participated in a Fifth Sunday Fireside in a Riverton, Utah ward with Paul and Susie Augenstein.
Yeah.
And this was probably 2018-ish.
Yeah, I think right around there.
Yeah, I think it was like February of 2018. And if you want just a little plug for the podcast, I believe it's episode 99 with Paul and Susie, where they explain this meeting. But within this meeting, you and a few other people were brought in to a Fifth Sunday Fireside to speak of your experience. And the topic of your talk was about ingredients and labeling and who am I? And I was just so moved, and so were the hundreds of people in the audience. Maybe spend a couple of minutes just explaining what you spoke to there and how that resonates in your life and where you're moving forward with that in the future.
Yeah. So I kind of started that was the first time I really spoke publicly about who I was. It's so hard I was in the car with my mom on the way to that meeting, because she came, down from Idaho to support me in that. And I was in the car and I was like, Mom, how do I even begin to share my experience when I have someone who I divorced who's living out their own story here? Like, I don't know where she's at right now. I don't know how she's feeling. I don't know if she would be comfortable with me speaking to this. I still consider that when I tell my story in a public forum. But I just thought, what right do I have to even speak to this when there's two sides to this story? And, that it's a space I still occupy. But she just said, Kent, like, it's her story to tell, and she has her story to tell if she ever chooses to or wants to. And she's like, people need to hear, some of the things that you've experienced, and there's going to be people on similar paths who will value and benefit from this. And I thought, okay. And so I started that, talk, as it were, in that meeting, talking about ingredients, like you said. And so I use that analogy of like an ingredients label because it was just something that spoke to me personally. And I just thought, if you look at an ingredient label on anything you buy, the nutrition facts, there's all of the, nutrition data, the percent daily values of every different, vitamin and mineral and micro and macronutrient, gives you a quick breakdown. And then there's a list of ingredients. And the, I guess, sort of unique thing about the list of ingredients is there is a rhyme and reason to it. And most people know this, but if you read the list of ingredients, the one that is most abundant is at the top of the list, and the one that is least abundant is at the bottom of the list. So if you're, eating a granola bar, chief among those ingredients on the top of the list are going to be things like oats and nuts and honey, or whatever the case. And then you get toward the bottom and there's going to be trace amounts of maybe certain spices or other things to complete that recipe. But it's kind of a unique thing to look at a list of ingredients and think, oh, there's mostly this thing, and it's at the top of the list as a result. So oddly, I found some parallels with that. And I kind of started this talk by saying, if you read my ingredient label 2 years ago, it would have read like this. And I said, my ingredient label would have said something like Kent Carollo, gay, broken, apostate, scared, all of these different things. And towards the end of the list, it said things like returned missionary, brother, son, artist, music aficionado, BYU Hawaii graduate. And I shared that to paint the picture that at one point in my life, most of my life, my first ingredient was being gay. And everything after that was inconsequential, was less abundant than that first ingredient. It's how I felt the world viewed me. It's how I viewed myself. That as long as I had one ingredient that was right at the top of the list, everything else was less significant and less critical to my personal identity and composition. And then I showed a new label that said, this is how I look at myself more today. And it was more or less an inverse of that previous label. It started with things like Kent Carollo, male, 30 years old at the time, artist, illustrator, music aficionado, brother, son. And at that point, my last ingredient was gay, because it just was less consequential to me then. And I remember sharing this with a friend at some point, and I was like, yeah, this is kind of how I'm navigating this and how I see myself. And he's like, Ken, that's kind of flawed. And I was like, what? No, it's the perfect analogy. What are you talking about? Like, I'm a nutrition facts label. I'm an ingredient list. It's fine. And he's like, but you're making it sound like being gay is like totally inconsequential when it's like a really important ingredient. And I was like, well, maybe. And he's like, and you're kind of making it sound like you almost need to like bury it. Or like maybe you wish you could just root that out of your recipe altogether. And I was like, shoot, oh my gosh. So while it's a nice simple analogy to lead with and to be like, gay's not everything, that's the point. But it really got me rethinking. I was like, you know what? The only time that ingredient was problematic is when it made me less of everything else I was made of. And I took a closer look at that because of his response. And I thought, you know what? Being gay isn't poison in your recipe. It's not like I have to make sure there's as little as possible in there. It's not something to be removed from your identity. It's not something to be buried or just mildly peppered in. It only becomes problematic when it makes you less of everything else. And I think that was kind of how I tried to round out that analogy by saying, that ingredient isn't, worthy of condemnation or removal from who you are. But it's hard if you're perceived as only that ingredient and people no longer see you as anything else. That's where it gets problematic. And it gets problematic if you see yourself that way. The other beautiful thing about the analogy I found is that the recipe can change every day. Sometimes I walk into a room and gay is top of the list. Sometimes I walk into a room and gay is at the bottom of the list. Sometimes it's in the middle. Like, the recipe can change, and that's okay. Totally okay. Because given the context and where you're at, like, it is going to change. We try not to be sociopaths, right? Like, but the truth is, you adjust and adapt to who you're speaking with and where you are. If I'm talking to a group of at-risk LGBTQ youth, I want them to know that I'm gay immediately, because that's the common ground that we share. If I meet somebody on the street, I don't necessarily owe them that, or it may not have the context. But all that to say, it's an imperfect analogy, but one that's helped me kind of identify myself and take a bit of ownership as to how I explain that to people and why giving value to all of the different parts of me is important. And it's sort of the quickest way that I do that when I meet someone, is kind of just give them a quick profile of those ingredients.
I love it as much now as I did in 2018 when I heard it the first time. Because I think it does frame a very honest and realistic perspective, because it just means something. It resonates really, really well. Is there anything we haven't discussed that you wanted to bring up?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I could probably talk for a long time about things I've learned or, paths I've crossed. And there's a lot there, I think, when you live out certain experiences. But, I just think, to leave any last anecdotal advice, I just think it's important for people to realize that I think we feel like we need permission sometimes to do things or to think a certain way or be a certain way. I think having been raised in the culture and that the doctrine of the church, we looked for cues a lot of the time. We looked for permission. We looked for guidance and direction, and that's not a bad thing. But that can also be applied in different contexts. And if you find yourself sitting somewhere thinking, I wish I just had permission to come out, or I wish I had permission to date, who I want to date, or love who I want to love, or I wish I just had permission to try coffee, or something that seems forbidden or taboo to you, and you're sort of waiting, in the wings for permission, chances are you're the one to give yourself that permission, and you don't have to wait. I thought I needed it in order to start dating. I think I subconsciously was waiting for some church leader or someone to validate me and say, Kent, you've done your best. Go see what it's like. Go date and gain the experience you need to draw your own conclusions. I think I was waiting for that. I think I was waiting for someone to tell me that I was allowed to find joy after a divorce. I was kind of waiting for that permission. I think I was waiting for someone to tell me that I could be gay and Mormon, or I couldn't be gay and Mormon at length. That there wasn't an either or. It was, can't you have permission to carve the path that is best for you? And I think if you find yourself just waiting for that permission, it's good to step back and think, who am I waiting to validate me? Who am I waiting for the permission from? Why am I waiting at all? And why shouldn't I give myself permission to do what is very best for me? And so that's something I've kind of tried to learn and implement and keep in mind as I've navigated this myself, but something I still continue to try to practice every day.
Thank you. And when you see Kent, thank him for giving himself permission. Because I think your experience has been really, really profound. And your experience has been able to influence the lives of others. And for that, I think we're all better people. Not only through your advocacy, but your personal work and translates into art. And again, now you start to better understand how each of those ingredients are impacted by authenticity and honesty. How each of those things that make us up are made better because of who and what we are.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It's been a great opportunity to better understand your experience. And again, thank you for sharing it and giving us a few minutes to highlight the life of Kent Carollo.
It's been a pleasure.
And onward and upward.
That's the plan.
No stopping. Thanks again, Kent. And again, we want to thank you for giving us an hour of your time to better understand the experience of the LGBTQ community. It's podcast episodes like this that help us bridge the reality and sexuality of each of our panelists and guests with the experiences of those who are trying to better understand this community. If you want to help us build bigger and stronger bridges between the LDS and LGBTQ community, we invite you to share episodes just like this. If you are following along on our video version through Facebook or YouTube, we invite you to like, subscribe, and even comment on this episode. It'll help us to expand our reach. And if you have a question directly for our guest today, we invite you to comment it below. And I'm sure we can get Kent to respond to that. If not, we all will, which has always been a great experience. Often people ask us how to best support the Latter-day Stories podcast. There are a couple simple and easy ways of doing that. If you want to make a financial donation, we are Venmo friendly at Latter-day Stories, or you can log on to our website at lattergaystories.org and click on the donate tab if you want to make a monthly donation to the podcast. And one of the other most influential ways of helping us is, again, by sharing episodes just like this. Even a simple comment helps get this episode and content like it out into the world of social media where people are able to interact and respond. Again, we want to thank you for giving us a few minutes of your time, and want to thank our guest again, Kent, today for sharing his story, because it's stories just like his that help us to continue writing our latter-gay story.